incredible change. Unspeakable horrors and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century where we showed what we are truly capable of. The pure imagination of artistic expression. The insidious desire to harm and oppress. The will to fight against the weight of a prevailing status quo. The drive to understand the universe and to improve our lives. A century made by leaders and revolutionaries, scientists and thinkers, artists,
wait till you see Muhammad Ali.
Icons, heroes, and villains. We will count down through the 101 figures of the 20th century who have shaped the world in which we live and whose stories form the tapestry of our history. On this episode,
in many ways, he solved a problem for surrealism that was looking for a sort of visual interpretation of their ideas.
I think she will be remembered for the brand of economics, which ultimately pulls apart the social fabric of countries.
We haven't really seen that before. It was the quintessential elegance of France, encapsulated in a house.
She was the Iron Lady, Britain's most influential post-World War II Prime Minister. Her policies would change the economic and social face of the nation.
I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown, the Iron Lady of the Western world.
Margaret Thatcher broke one of the most significant glass ceilings in the world when in 1979, she became Britain's first female Prime Minister. Yet she would publicly state that she owed nothing to the women's liberation movement. Thatcher used her agenda to promote her ability to get the job done, likening the nation's accounts to a household budget, positioning herself as the housewife who would clean up the country. Her approach to economic reform was based in individualism and personal responsibility.
There's only one way to do well. There's no magic about it. It's the way I'm trying to follow. I'm saying to people, you can't avoid the consequences of your own action.
In 1980, the country fell into a recession and unemployment skyrocketed. Riots broke out in cities across Britain, and Thatcher's popularity in the polls reached the lowest point of any prime minister since records began.
They're angered especially by unemployment, which has now passed the 2.5 million mark. But the rally also reflects the deep-felt anger in many parts of Britain against Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her government.
Prime Minister Thatcher decided that she needed to radically change the economic fortunes of the United Kingdom. She saw the solution as taking on the organised trade union movement of that country.
Thatcher's troubled relationship with the unions reached boiling point in 1984 with a strike over planned coal pit closures. Her decision to deploy police to break the strike lines led to a string of violent confrontations. The biggest clash was a pitched battle at Aldgreave near Sheffield, where 7,000 police fought 5,000 strikers. It took 12 months, but Thatcher broke the strike and the trade union movement was left severely weakened.
If you are permanently pitting those who are the owners of capital against those who are the owners of labour in some continuing class struggle, then we have a real problem for the future.
The darker side of her policies was a rapid increase in social and economic inequality.
She seemed very cold and very hard and very determined. And I didn't really like what she did to my country. It felt like she turned the country into a place where people only cared about making money.
Thatcher may have divided the nation on national issues, but she was an international power player. In April 1982, Argentina invaded the British-ruled Falkland Islands. When Thatcher sent British forces to retake the islands, her approval rating soared.
Two things. Just listen to everyone. I must go down and talk.
She was also focused on maintaining Britain's special relationship with America, forming close ties with American President Ronald Reagan, and was instrumental in Reagan's negotiations on nuclear disarmament with the Soviet Union's President Gorbachev. Thatcher governed Britain through 11 tumultuous years.
I think she will be remembered for the brand of economics which was out of Margaret Thatcher, by Ronald Reagan, and what I would describe as the extreme form of liberal market fundamentalism, one which ultimately pulls apart the social fabric of countries.
In Britain, her ideology would be dubbed Thatcherism, a term used by some as criticism and others as praise.
Some people hated her because they hated the kind of things she was doing, and some people didn't like the fact a woman was running the country, let's face it. Other people really admired her, and, you know, to this day, you know, she's, like her or loathe her, she is one of the great political figures of the last century in Britain.
In the early decades of the 20th century, a creative movement emerged that challenged the art establishment: Surrealism. There was one artist who embodied Surrealism in both his work and public life. Salvador Dali arrived on the Paris Surrealist scene in 1928. His art capturing the great aspirations of the movement.
In many ways, he solved a problem for Surrealism that was looking for a sort of visual interpretation of their ideas. Dali gave us legible symbols that we could read.
During the 1930s in Paris, Dali developed what he called the paranoid critical method, experiencing a self-induced paranoid state and then painting what he witnessed. Dali was certainly not shy about expressing his art or his character. In every public appearance, his eccentric behavior, strange outfits, and distinctive moustache all contributed to his carefully cultivated persona.
Dali is crazy. I'm crazy about American dollar.
But behind this was an incredible artist who painted some of the most recognizable artworks of the 20th century. The American years, from 1939, are seen as more commercial and somehow less important. This was the period when Dali turned the creation of his art into public performance.
I think in many ways it's very hard to judge the Paris period and the New York period with the same standards. They're different. One, you've got Dali, the painter, and one, you've got the performer. If we go to look at his paintings after the Paris period, then we're not going to find such satisfaction. But if we look to his performance, we're going to find real riches.
You might think that all he's doing is slushing paint about, but it takes genius to slush like that and get paid for it.
What Dali created in these later years was significant. He brought the surrealist aesthetic into the mainstream. Always a subversive thinker, he introduced notions of the dream consciousness into everyday items.
Salvador Dali influences many artists. Perhaps most it's this idea of the extraordinary, of putting things together that we don't normally consider go together. That idea, that incongruity, is absolutely central to contemporary art.
Dali expected his art to be respected, but he did not draw a line as to how and where that art could be expressed.
When you got it, flaunt it.
That his work and his persona endure today can be credited to his desire to take his art to his audience. He was a man who understood the importance of publicity, even over talent. But he also had a remarkable talent driving his creation. 1949. The Second World War had ended 4 years earlier, but the world was still reeling from 6 years of unspeakable violence and loss. When a voice rose that promised a path to lasting peace.
Faith has become known throughout the world.
I believe that we stand on the verge of a historic moment that could have an unparalleled and unprecedented impact in a world that is confused, perplexed, and frustrated at this hour.
Billy Graham began preaching the gospel in a revival tent in Los Angeles in 1949. His message was simple and effective, that we could all find peace and salvation by living for Christ. A promise of hope for humanity that many were ready to hear.
120,000, yes, 120,000 people went to Wembley for Billy Graham's farewell meeting.
He presented a new kind of public evangelism, the kind of charismatic preacher that people hadn't seen since the beginning of the 20th century. He was much more about hope, about the possibility of an individual connection with God via the words of the Bible that existed beyond and outside of a kind of church hierarchy.
From a tent in Los Angeles, he would go on to crusade around America, to Berlin, to India, London, and New York. He preached in African villages and at the inaugurations of US presidents. Graham used his growing profile to take a stand on civil rights. He preached that Christ did not see the exterior, but rather straight to the heart of men.
What is it in the nature of men that causes men to lie and hate and cheat and steal and lust and have pride and bigotry and intolerance and racial intolerance? What is it that causes men to have these terrible things down inside of them?
By the early 1950s, Graham would only preach to integrated audiences. And in 1957, he hosted Martin Luther King as a guest speaker at his New York crusades. He would later bail King out of jail after he was arrested during a protest in Albany, Georgia.
Even among Southern fundamentalists, Billy Graham was shocking to people in his anti-segregation stance. And that was really critical, I think, for bringing that message to Southern audiences and bringing the message to people who weren't political.
In a career that spanned over 50 years, Billy Graham rose to an unprecedented level of international prominence. He personally preached to nearly 215 million people in more than 185 countries and territories. And he built a global multimedia empire that reached over 2 billion people worldwide. Graham's success was in his ability to bridge the divides of nationality and ideology with a simple idea, the promise of a better tomorrow. In the late 1970s, the market for marijuana was starting to wane. A new drug was rising, cocaine. In the coming decade, it would take control in a billion-dollar illegal industry spanning the Americas and the world.
This is the battlefield, and this is the enemy. Dealers peddling deadly drugs, destroying lives and neighborhoods.
Between 1976 and 1993, cocaine use was at its peak, and one man was inexorably linked with the drug: Pablo Escobar. He rose through the ranks of the drug trade in Colombia, using business savvy and violence to form the Medellin cartel, a powerhouse in the drug trade that dominated trafficking to America for over a decade. By the mid-1980s, his cartel smuggled over 15 tons of cocaine into America every day.
I think Pablo Escobar had a massive influence. In some sense, he fueled the 1980s. We have the rise of Wall Street with its rampant drug use. We have party culture emerging in the United States.
Escobar's multi-billion-dollar operations were based in Medellin, a city rife with poverty. But he knew how to win the hearts of the people.
A Robin Hood image is projected and nurtured, handing out money to the peasants and building new homes for them when the government won't. Nearly everyone in Medellin supports the cartel. Those who don't are either dead or the targets of retribution.
Escobar was at his most violent in his resistance to extradition to America, enacting a reign of terror to force the Colombian government to guarantee he would not be extradited. Escobar's actions led to thousands of deaths, from politicians and judges to ordinary citizens. No one was safe.
Violence rules indiscriminately. 12 died and more than 200 passers-by were injured in this recent explosion.
The violence that had spilled into the streets had turned public opinion against him. Escobar's empire was unraveling, and American drug authorities were closing in. When they finally caught him, he was shot and killed. Escobar was responsible for terrible acts of violence and intimidation. But the ripples of his influence were felt far beyond this. Cocaine use in the 1980s was an epidemic that devastated millions of lives. And yet there remains an enduring fascination with Pablo Escobar.
I think Pablo Escobar remains a strange figure of aspiration in the media and the popular imagination because he is one of a series of outlaws that are romanticized, not only in the United States, but around the world.
An infallible figure who amassed a level of power and wealth that has become legendary. A self-made man who cast himself as protector, but was equally, or more accurately, destroyer.
For years, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for the followers and participants in the sport of track and field had always been the elusive 4-minute mile.
The 4-minute mile. The unbreakable barrier. A symbol of the limitations of how far the human body could be pushed. For years, a mythology grew around the idea of breaking the 4-minute mile as though it was an impossible feat. But on a windy, unpleasant day in May 1954, it would finally happen. Roger Bannister was studying for his medical degree. His grueling study schedule left him only 45 minutes a day to train as a runner. He approached his training with clinical precision and a deep understanding of the human body.
The training was important, and even nowadays we use the methods that Bannister used, running repetition 400s and running a lot of those at the speed that you want to run the mile. We do that all the time now.
To prepare for the race, he studied his own oxygen consumption, discovering that he used less if he ran at a steady pace. He watched footage of himself training to better evaluate how he could improve his running, becoming renowned for his incredible form.
Bannister's long, easy stride was soon shaking off all competition.
To beat the 4-minute mile, Bannister understood how crucial it was that he ran on a quality track, that the wind and weather conditions were favorable, and that he wouldn't get to the finish line alone. Working closely with training mates Chris Brasher and Chris Chataway, pace setters in the race, they would propel him forward at precisely the right moment. Bannister also valued well-maintained gear, using a grindstone in a hospital lab to sharpen the spikes on his running cleats before the race. With meticulous preparation, an otherwise ordinary day became a moment in history.
With 250 yards to go, 25-year-old Bannister took the lead with an amazing burst of speed. He went on to achieve the world record of a mile in under 4 minutes, sought after by athletes for over 40 years.
He had done it. But he would be the first to acknowledge that no athlete is self-sufficient or unbeatable.
If you can find a man who will run it in 3:59, you will most certainly find somebody else in the world at some time who will run it faster.
He was right. 6 weeks after he broke the record, Australian John Landy broke his.
And now, John Landy has shattered Bannister's figures by running the mile in 3 minutes 58.
Since Bannister's first sub-4-minute mile, over 1,300 people have achieved the same feat. Yet he'll always be remembered for that moment when he proved the incredible feats the human body is capable of.
The breaking of the 4-minute mile opened up everybody's attitude as, I can be better than I think I can. I can do things that perhaps I didn't think I could do before. I think the world stood up, took notice, and it became a different place.
A mastermind of toy promotion. In the final decades of the 20th century, his ideas would fundamentally change the global toy market. Bernard Loomis made his name in the toy industry with an ingenious idea, using children's cartoons to sell lines of toys.
Hi, I'm Jack Wheeler of the Hot Wheels.
A world of products to keep kids coming back for more. By the 1980s, the concept dominated children's television.
In the 20th century, particularly 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when there really was a Saturday morning block of television, which there really isn't anymore, they were advertising during these cartoons and getting tremendous focus from kids.
While Loomis never had his own toys as a child, he repeatedly showed his knack for picking the characters and properties with massive market potential as a toy, a quality he referred to as toyetic. He also understood the power of television marketing. While working at Mattel in 1960, he devised the strategy for the first talking doll.
Oh, Chatty Cathy, oh, Mattel's famous talking doll. We pull the ring, and you say 11 different things. Let's play house.
Chatty Cathy was only made possible through the market boost from TV advertising. Otherwise, the cost of developing the talking mechanism would never have been matched by demand.
Will you play with me?
Loomis's most high-profile success came while he was head of toy company Kenner Products, in an action figure license he bought for a new film in 1977, Star Wars. At the time of the film's release, the toy line was almost a year away. But the demand was instant. The film was a success from its opening day, and fans wanted merchandise.
Kenner had no clue that it was going to take off like this. So they ended up, like a month before Christmas, with no action figures left. An enormous demand. So they did something which in the toy industry is historic. They sold a certificate that said within 6 months, you could turn this certificate in and get your Star Wars action figure.
Loomis's gamble paid off. More than 500,000 certificates were sold. Essentially an empty box, a few stickers, and a promise. From the moment this line of Star Wars toys hit shelves in 1978 until they were discontinued in 1986, Kenner Products sold 250 million figures worldwide and garnered over $750 million in toy sales.
What it really did was it created a partnership in which toy companies have a input on the script, so that the creator of the movie creates moments in which they actually can be turned into toys.
The level of success defined a new paradigm for film merchandising, a marriage of film development and toy development that, for better or worse, persists today. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, she was a woman in a man's world, facing opposition, doubt, and incredible personal risk to become one of the most important scientists of her time. Marie Curie and her husband Pierre were working at the School of Chemistry and Physics in Paris when Marie began studying the mineral pitchblende. It contained uranium ore, but Marie was convinced that its high level of radioactivity meant that another substance was present. The pair set out to prove her right, and in doing so, added two undiscovered elements to the periodic table: polonium and radium. In 1903, they were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for their work. After her husband's death in 1906, Marie continued their research and was appointed to his professorship, becoming the first woman to teach at the Sorbonne. In 1911, she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for creating a means of measuring radioactivity, making her the first woman to win a Nobel Prize as an individual and the only woman to win in two categories. At the onset of the First World War, Marie turned her attention to helping develop mobile X-ray, traveling to the front lines herself to set up the units. After the war, Marie continued to win awards for her research and teaching work. But she also faced opposition from the male scientific community in France and never saw much financial benefit from her efforts. Marie worked with some of the most dangerous substances in the world, often handling them with little or no protection. It would ultimately be the cause of her death in 1934. She strove to realize her gift for science, no matter the personal cost or the social forces that opposed her. Her legacy endures today as a role model for women aspiring to work in male-dominated fields.
I think she did a great deal for women by her example, by excellence, showing that you could become what she became, which was pretty extraordinary.
Hitler, Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, Mussolini. Their names instantly remind us of the darkest days of the 20th century. But there are also the fighters, the names that tell us of victories and defeats, living beyond a single deed. Patton, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Zhukov, MacArthur, Rommel. Erwin Rommel was a military man. Before Hitler and the Third Reich, Rommel had made his mark fighting in the First World War as a lieutenant on the battlefields of France, Romania, and Italy. Rommel was building a reputation in Germany as a military strategist and teacher when the Second World War broke out. He would once again get to test his theories on the battlefield.
His reputation as a leader then became rather more controversial, particularly in North Africa, because there he was always attacking, always pushing his men. But there was no doubt about it, he was quite a good strategist.
As commander of the German troops in North Africa, Rommel led the Africa Corps to victory against the English at Tobruk in 1942. With this victory, a mythology began to build around the man.
What a scoop he was for Dr. Goebbels, who by lionizing the Marshal used him to the utmost advantage as a heaven-sent piece of propaganda.
The German propaganda machine labeled him the People's Marshal. The Allies referred to him as the Desert Fox.
The British, to the astonishment even of the Germans, and in fact Goebbels' absolute joy, turned Rommel into a hero.
In June 1944, the Allies had invaded Normandy, overwhelming German defenses. A month later, growing disillusionment over Germany's involvement in the war fueled an attempt on Hitler's life. It failed. Rommel's name emerged as a conspirator.
Hitler was hugely suspicious of Rommel, and that's why Rommel was given no option but to commit suicide with the cyanide pill, the threat being that otherwise his family would be arrested and he would be forced before a people's court and then executed afterwards. So he was given no choice in that particular way.
The official cause of Rommel's death was that he succumbed to injuries from an Allied bombing of his car weeks earlier. His involvement in the plot to kill Hitler was never confirmed. By 1951, Hollywood was already depicting Rommel's life as that of a hero trapped in difficult circumstances. The Nazi that we were allowed to like. A telling that was fervently contested at the time, and which is still opposed by many historians. The real Erwin Rommel lies beneath layers of possibilities, propaganda, half-truth. So the mythology lives on, maintaining Rommel's position as one of the most contentious and intriguing figures of the 20th century. From a record label to airlines and credit cards, he turned his spirit of adventure and knack for marketing into a globally recognized brand.
Richard Branson's leadership style was unorthodox. Part of it starts with just the way he presented himself. This guy with long hair and a beard in a world in which people were very buttoned down. Everybody else wore suits. He would wear an open shirt. People lived in mansions. He lived on a houseboat. It was intentionally unorthodox and laid back. But I think it's important to keep in mind that as much as that is his image and that's real, there's a very shrewd and organized business mind behind this.
In the early years, Branson was dedicated to all things music, launching his Virgin Records music label in 1973.
A young lad who was 15 years old had an album that he'd made called Tubular Bells, and we decided to form a record company just to put that album out, and that then helped us sort of build, what became the, maybe the best independent record label in the world.
A label that would be home to generation-defining acts like the Sex Pistols and later the Rolling Stones. His success didn't end there. Branson was always looking to make the next leap. One of his riskiest ventures was the launch of his airline, Virgin Atlantic, in 1984, offering a new alternative for transatlantic flights against industry giant British Airways. Branson's new company posed such a threat that British Airways retaliated, ending up in court, pleading guilty to disreputable business practices. The payout that British Airways had to make to Branson, he then distributed to his staff. Dubbed the BA bonus, this was how Branson operated.
This is an industry that is notoriously difficult. And what he has managed to do is not just create an airline that works, but one that people genuinely seem to like and that is distinctive in the marketplace.
The success of Branson's companies and brand is a testament to his talent for promotion.
For Richard Branson, marketing plans weren't about a spreadsheet and where we're going to place products and place advertisements. They're really about getting as much attention, and attention in a positive way. And one of the ways to do that was to create events that would bring people in and get you a lot of free publicity and help kind of create an image in the marketplace.
Richard Branson built an empire of more than 200 companies in over 30 countries. Through it all, he was always exploring new horizons. By the end of the century, he was looking to the depths of the ocean and out into the stars.
I've never thought of myself as an entrepreneurial businessman. I just, love creating things. So instead of creating record companies, now I'm creating spaceship companies.
Branson had his share of successes, but his share of failures too. It was that acceptance of risk that has kept him at the cutting edge of consumer culture for decades. A radical departure from the status quo in women's fashion. His work was celebrated as a new look. But for many, it was a return to bygone days where women dressed to be decorative.
In Paris, though the famous boulevards are neither gay nor full of well-dressed women, ideas about the future of fashion are forming.
1947. Paris was recovering from the ravages of World War II, when Christian Dior, at 42 years old, released his first fashion collection. The prevailing silhouette of post-World War II women's fashion was square shoulders and shorter skirts. Dior completely subverted this. His style focusing on high busts, narrow waists, and accentuated hips.
We haven't really seen that before, that miles of skirt and the tiny waist and that beautiful jacket. I think the juxtaposition of the two of them with that masculine tailoring at the top and the beautiful skirt at the bottom, it was very fresh.
Harper's Bazaar magazine would enthusiastically dub it the new look. But it would prove to be an incredibly divisive new style.
She liked the new length, but not the new look. Certainly, the new look is still very much a matter of personal choice.
I believe there was an element of shock about it, not because it was particularly revealing, but probably because they hadn't seen this unbridled femininity like that for many years, understandably. It heralded a new era in couture.
The wealthy took to it immediately. The clothes represented opulence, elegance, and innovation. To others, they were impractical and excessive. The corsetry and unworkable design was a step backwards for women who had been working through the war. They didn't want to return to fashions that positioned them as ornamental. Despite such strong objections, the tide of change was coming. By the release of Dior's second collection, his styles were already being copied by other fashion houses. Grace Kelly, Jane Mansfield, Ava Gardner, and Lauren Bacall all favored Dior's styles, lending the look even more glamour. Only 10 years after releasing his iconic new look in 1957, Dior died suddenly of a heart attack. But his legacy lives on.
I feel that when you thought of couture, you thought of Christian Dior, that rarefied sense of female beauty, the fabrics. It was the quintessential elegance of France encapsulated in a house.
His new look is one of the most highly recognizable fashions of the 20th century. An ideological and cultural shift in the wake of the Second World War. His work may have fueled controversy and cultural backlash, but the brand he created remains one of the most significant luxury goods in the market today. (1955). On radio waves across America, one song was heralding the arrival of a new sound. Its effervescent lyrics capturing a teenage fascination with fast cars and romance. The rock and roll revolution had begun. The song was Maybelline. Its architect was Chuck Berry.
It was such a breakthrough record for the entire rock and roll movement. You can't really underestimate the significance of Maybelline.
With Maybelline, he brought two familiar genres of music together into something new and fresh. Along with his quick, clever lyrics, it captured the spirit of 1950s teenagers.
Well, Maybelline dealt with cultural touchstones that were common currency among the day's youth. The idea of creating a love song and embodying it in an automobile. It's a very mid-century America, very much something, a sentiment that would echo with the teenagers of the day.
The response was palpable, earning the song the #1 spot on the R&B charts and a #5 spot on the pop charts. Maybelline's popularity was just the beginning for Chuck Berry. Between 1955 and 1965, he went on to release a series of top 40 hits, enduring classics like School Days, Sweet Little 16, and Johnny Be Good.
And Johnny Be Good was Chuck Berry mythologizing himself and, in doing so, mythologizing all of rock and roll.
This period of Chuck Berry's career would later be referred to as the Golden Decade. By the early 1960s, the British invasion was taking over. But his legacy as a founding father of rock and roll was assured.
He sketched out the blueprint for rock and roll, and without those guiding lights, there would have been no Beatles, there would have been no Rolling Stones, there would have been no anything that followed after.
When Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards inducted Chuck Berry into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, he acknowledged the influence Berry had on the genre. He famously declared, "It's very difficult for me to talk about Chuck Berry because I lifted every lick he ever played." From the nightclubs of St. Louis to the top of the charts, the ripples of Chuck Berry's musical career were felt through the second half of the 20th century.
And Chuck Berry was the legitimate father of rock and roll. All his songs seem to be about petty annoyances and irritations, but really they're digging into a much richer emotional subtext of the African-American experience. That expression, those feelings resonated with white American teenagers who felt repressed and constricted themselves.
Chuck Berry defined a new style of music, making songs that spoke to a generation, shaping the language and tone of rock and roll music, repeated by the many bands that followed. A world divided. For the states of Eastern Europe, the end of World War II had not brought the freedom that so many had fought and died for. In the decades that followed, the war continued, fought by individuals on a moral battleground. Poland, 1980. Life under the oppression of a communist regime was stifling. Lech Walesa, an electrician at the shipyards at Gdansk, was a ringleader among workers attempting to organize themselves into an independent labor movement. A role that would see him unemployed and under surveillance by the state. The country was wavering on the brink of economic collapse. Disillusionment bubbled beneath the surface of everyday life, rising up in workers' strikes and violent protest. In August 1980, at Lenin's shipyard, Lech Walesa jumped the fence to join the strikers, forcing the communist regime to acknowledge their demands for representation. From this moment, the Solidarity movement was born. The first independent, non-communist party trade union in the communist countries of Eastern Europe, with Lech Walesa voted in as their first chairman. It would be a short-lived victory. In late December 1981, under the threat of military intervention by the Soviet Union, Poland's communist leader, General Jaruzelski, imposed martial law. The leaders of Solidarity were detained.
They have answered the stirrings of liberty with brute force, killings, mass arrests, and the setting up of concentration camps. Lech Walesa and other Solidarity leaders are imprisoned, their fate unknown.
Walesa was kept under arrest at a remote country house for almost a year. He may not have been present in person, but the movement was kept alive around the world. The attention that Solidarity was receiving was undeniable. Almost a year after his arrest, Walesa was released and reinstated in his job at the shipyard. It would take another 6 years before they would see these events lead to real change for Poland. By 1989, under the pall of worsening economic conditions, the communist regime in Poland was weakening. They had no choice but to negotiate with Solidarity. The first free parliamentary election was held in June that year, with Solidarity candidates winning decisively. Communism in Poland was ending. The final step in dismantling the regime was the 1990 election of Lech Walesa as President of Poland. It started with a single demand: the freedom for workers to organize and fight for their rights. but paved the way for the end of communism in Eastern Europe, reminding the world what even a shipyard electrician is capable of when they don't back down. In the early hours of an April morning in 1962, a tragic discovery would bring to an end the tumultuous and spectacular career of one of Hollywood's shining stars. But it would not be the end of the public's fascination with her.
She's here, said the headlines, and everyone knew they meant the American film star with the famous shape and the wiggly walk.
Marilyn. So much meaning is imbued in just that one simple name. She was the bombshell, the quintessential movie star, the international sex symbol.
Marlon is part of our culture for everybody. She's an instant recognizable icon.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
There was an indefinable quality to Marilyn Monroe. Her appeal was in her humanity and her wit, the combination of vulnerability and sex appeal.
It was quite unearthly, her beauty, and I think it was because it was nuanced. There was a tenderness about her and a darkness about her, I think, that put her beauty into a whole other realm.
Marilyn was unique, a talented comedian and performer. She understood what the camera could do and how to connect to her audience through the lens. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn had starred in some of her most famous films, and her star in Hollywood was well and truly on the rise. To say the media followed her enthusiastically doesn't do justice to the frenzy of attention she received wherever she went. Whether she was entertaining the US troops in Korea or honeymooning with her second husband, baseball player Joe DiMaggio, every public appearance was met with the same fervor.
When a well-known honeymoon couple arrives at Tokyo Airport, a throng of 4,000 baseball and movie fans surge out of control, break through police lines. Never underestimate the power of you-know-who.
Behind Marilyn Monroe, the celebrity, was Norma Jean, the woman, daughter of a paranoid schizophrenic, a childhood spent in and out of foster care. The darker side of her life in Hollywood is the story of the self-medicating insomniac, chronically late to movie sets, prone to fits of depression.
I think that people felt there was a longing in her and a brokenness in her that connected, a bit like with James Dean. There was an edge to them that you connected with because in amongst all of this fame they were suffering, and that made them really human.
Competing versions of the woman leaves us with the sense that we never truly knew her. And now, never will. Her death, a supposed suicide, shocked the world. In the years since Marilyn died, the recurring conspiracy theories of her murder at the hands of the Kennedys or the Mafia or the FBI have only fueled the mythology that surrounds her. For over a decade, she was a dominant force in the entertainment industry. Photographs of her, young and vibrant, keep her caught in time, never outdated, never aging.
Although we know and remember her films, Marlon has almost been frozen by those iconic images. She has become a trademark of herself.
In the years since her death, she has endured as an icon of the screen and as a symbol of femininity. Her image, her work, and the love of the public have never diminished. In the next episode, a woman who dreamed of a toy to reflect a child's aspirations. A man who became the face of an oil crisis that changed the world. And the two teenagers who created one of the most iconic characters of the 20th century.